Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Uta, for your introduction, and thank you, Lisa, for chairing the session. In interwar Poland, the Yaakov network of schools for Orthodox Jewish females, sponsored by the Agudas Israel organization and the Agudas youth organization, Benos, represented an innovative approach to female education. Understanding this approach requires situating it in the context of other Eastern European approaches to Orthodox female education in the interwar years, which have attracted less attention. In my talk, I will present the Lithuanian Orthodox approach and contrast it with the Polish Orthodox approach, showing how each was rooted in an educational ethos that was unique to their respective communities and that until World War I applied only to Orthodox males. Now, since in both countries, Poland and Lithuania, there's an additional agency involved in the educational sphere, namely Keren Ha-Torah, Agudas Israel Torah Education Fund, that was established in 1923. It is important to say a few words about it. This fund was directed by Dr. Leo Deutschländer. He was a neo-Orthodox rabbi and a PhD. And during the World War I, he was a soldier in the German military serving in Lithuania. And he even stayed there a few years after the war, being involved in Jewish education. But I'll talk about him here in his capacity as a director of Keren Ha-Torah. And this is what he writes about the involvement of this fund, which funded Jewish religious education. At the first Great Assembly of Agudas Israel in 1923, there was a lively debate about the question of whether, according to its statute, Keren Ha-Torah was in a position to do educational work from a central office. The question whether they're just giving money or are they going to intervene in the content. The participants had no inclination to change the particular spiritual character of the different trends within Orthodox Judaism. As a result of this, the answer to this question was bypassed by declaring each country administration to be autonomous with regard to the education question. One more, Keren Ha-Torah headquarters felt all the more obliged to take this precaution as the sages of the East quite rightly see a severe danger in transplanting Western educational principles to the East. The educators from the West who were active in the East as part of Keren Ha-Torah were therefore only exponents of modern pedagogical technology. So they were involved in all countries, but only in the professional aspect of the education. So with that, we'll put aside Keren Ha-Torah and we'll go right away to the situation in Lithuania, which I'll later compare to the situation in interwar Poland. So the organization in charge of Jewish education in Lithuania was called Yavneh, in charge of Orthodox education. It was established in 1920. And here we have in one of their publications, by the way, the only place in the world where it exists is in the Royal Library in Denmark for some reason. The book is written in Yiddish, and it explains to the public what the organization, what is the mission, the educational mission of this organization. It was an independent organization. It was not an arm of any political party. So they have a chapter on just general chapters, and then a chapter on the education in the Heders, the one-room school for boys, regular schools for boys, evening classes, and also a chapter about the education of girls. And what does it say, this chapter? Of major significance is the good beginning that took place with the help of Yavneh in the sphere of female education, which until now was neglected by us and caused a great harm to Yiddishkeit. Tells provides a good, I'll explain what I'm reading when I'm done. Tells provides a good example. The high school for girls that was founded there with much devotion belongs to the best educational institutions in Lithuania, not only from a religious Jewish point of view, but also from a pedagogical educational one. It can serve as a model for a true Jewish educational institution for girls, not only for Lithuania. Now, this gymnasium, this high school was established in 1921, high school for girls. It was established with a blessing and involvement of the head of the Telz Yeshiva, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch, one of the major rabbinical figures in Lithuania. It was a classical gymnasium which offered a matura option, and indeed some of the graduates of this gymnasium continued their studies in the university. As you see here, Yavneh considered it a model school, an ideal solution for the problem of the education of females, not just for Lithuania. And let's look at some photographs. So first, the name of the gymnasium, Hebrew-Gymnasium. Indeed, all the Jewish religious subjects were taught in the Hebrew language. We can see here the photograph on the right is the first graduating class of the gymnasium. The second photograph is all the students at the gymnasium in that year, 1926. Interestingly, such a formal, official type of photograph, I haven't seen it in any Beis Yaakov school, and I'll talk about Beis Yaakov later, in Poland. There are many, many pictures, but they're not official. They don't look like, you know, here with the teachers in the middle and the students around them. Yeah, okay, let's continue. Yavneh established also a teacher's seminary for males and females. It was also called Yavneh Female Hebrew Teachers Seminary. As for girls, it accepted only graduates of the gymnasium. Okay, let's continue. And again, you see a very formal type of photograph. In the next few years, in 1925, a Yavneh Hebrew Gymnasium was established in Kovno, in 1928 in Panevėžys. I want to make a correction here because some, especially recently, are under the impression that this was a Beis Yaakov school. It was not. You can see here well, it was first a Talmud Torah, a boys' religious school. It was called Beis Yaakov after the name of the donor, Yaakov Luria. And then it housed the Yavneh Gymnasium. And you can see, here it's called the Lyceum, and it still says on the photograph, Talmud Torah Bet Yaakov, and the name of the donor. Also in Ponevezh, it was established with the involvement of Rabbi Kahneman, the head of the famous yeshiva in the place. So there were a total of 3 Yavneh girls gymnasium in Lithuania. I think at this time there were a little over 150,000 Jews in Lithuania after World War I. I'll later speak also about the regions that were annexed to Poland. Moving right along. Here we have a sort of a brochure or a booklet that is devoted to the education of boys and girls, both of them in one book. As we'll see later, in Poland, there were completely separate programs for boys and girls. Here, it's all in one. This is the program or the curriculum for primary schools, and it had very detailed chapters about what was studied there. And here, if you see, I know it's all in Hebrew, but I have a translation of all the important things. So if we look at the right, it's the weekly program for boys. And on the left, it's the weekly program for girls. It's more or less, the girls have, I think, 2 hours less per week, but it's more or less the same subjects. One interesting thing for Torah, for the Pentateuch, in the boys program, it says Torah and Rashi. Rashi was a medieval commentator. This is a standard learning of Torah. It's usually done with his commentary. In the girls program, it just says Torah. Now it is my guess, based on other things that I read, although not directly about this, teaching girls Rashi, teaching this commentary was considered problematic because Rashi cites all kinds of paragraphs from the Talmud, which is considered the oral law, and girls are prohibited from studying the Talmud. There is also a footnote when it says the program for girls, and here I have the translation of the footnote. All the subjects are taught according to the distribution of material and curriculum for Yavneh primary school for boys. But the teacher should introduce some changes according to the hours devoted to each subject and the attention paid to the unique qualities of female education and its requirements. It doesn't explain what those requirements are. Again, it is my guess that it's the question of Rashi. Now, where for the boys it says Talmud, on this table for girls, it says Agada. Agada are non-legal rabbinic material, stories, ethical maxim, and so on, which girls are allowed to study. And here the brochure gives all kinds of material that can be used to teach the girls. But generally speaking, it's more or less the same program. And we can now move to Poland. So I'll start with this brochure. This is a second brochure. I didn't come across the first one. The title of this brochure is How Should a Jew Educate His Child? And it was published by Agudas Israel. So we already see, while in Lithuania we have an independent educational organization, in interwar Poland, education is done under the auspices of the political party Agudas Israel. And just to show you how it looks, as I said, I have all the translation. The caption is the education of our daughters, and then it talks about the Bais Yaakov schools. And what does it say? I'll read it. While in the sphere of the religious education of boys, the religious society needed to introduce only a series of external improvements in order to compete with the secular schools, the situation in the sphere of the religious education of girls was much sadder and catastrophic. So similar to Yavneh, where they said that the education of girls were neglected, we have here a similar type of assessment of what was done before World War I. Without the minimal experience, without the necessary knowledge, without a tradition and the necessary pedagogic means, the religious society faced the problem of female education helpless. Already at the time of the German occupation during the war, an Orthodox female gymnasium, Chavah, was established in Warsaw, which exists until today. This is 1930. But because a gymnasium is a luxurious thing and unfit for the broader masses, and also because of other motives, which he doesn't detail, this did not solve the problem. Now, a few words of Chavah. It was a full-fledged gymnasium. It offered matura to those students who were wishing to take it. It remained the only Orthodox classical gymnasium in the interwar Poland. In the 1930s, a trade gymnasium was established in Warsaw, but it didn't offer the matura. It was established by Rabbi Dr. Emanuel Karlebach, who was sent with another colleague as an advisor to the German occupying army. And it was his initiative to establish this gymnasium. And as I said, it remained a lonely type of educational institution. And then the brochure continues. It was necessary to establish a primary school for girls, which would inspire the children with the treasures of the Jewish Torah spirit and tradition. This is how it happened. In 1917, following the initiative of the I think I miscopied it. Conscientious Kraków, perhaps it's conscious, I don't know. Sorry about that. Kraków woman Sarah Schenirer, a Jewish Orthodox girls' school was established. After Agudas Israel began to take more interest in this movement, and Keren Ha-Torah incorporated Bais Yaakov in its work, it was decided to develop the Kraków school as a temporary teachers' seminary. Okay, so we see here again that Agudas Israel took over this project. It started around 1925. There were already several Bais Yaakov schools by that time, and they were managed by local branches of the Aguda. Only in 1925, the central party, Agudas Israel, not just the local branches, took it under its auspices. Because of the great demand for teachers, and because the current localities of the seminary are completely unfit for a seminary and a dormitory, which needs to be certified by the school council, Keren Ha-Torah initiated the construction of a seminary with a dormitory with all the accompanying facilities. I want to say something about that. Now, the certification is not for the seminary. The certification has to do with the conditions, physical conditions, hygiene, and etc. Since many girls would live in small apartments and so on. By that time, the seminary had an apartment on Augustianska Street, and this is where the girls lived. I'll talk about it a little later. And this is where classes were given, and then were also summer courses. The Bais Yaakov movement also acquired a good reputation in the whole world. Even half assimilationist circles showed sympathy and supported it because they see in it the only saving grace for the young female generation in Poland. So unlike Yavneh, which was proud initially was a gymnasium entails as being one of the best in the country and so on. Here, the pride is not about the level of study, but the role of the seminary in saving the female generation from assimilation. The course of study was 2 years after primary school. I'll talk about it a little later. Now, unlike in Yavneh, where we had in one booklet the study program for boys and girls, here they are completely two separate arms, education of boys and education of girls. So this is from a booklet about the program for boys. It's in the Hebrew language. Here I have just the weekly program, but the booklet itself is very detailed. It even goes as far as telling in every year which chapters of the Talmud, which commentators, and so on. And the number of hours is much greater than the school in Lithuania. So this is for boys. What about girls? So here we have a program for girls. It says a program for the study of Yahadut or Yahadus, how the way they would pronounce it at that time. I don't even know what the best literal translation of this is. It's like Jewishness. As a matter of fact, as Orlean, Yehuda Leib Orlean, who used to be the principal of the full-fledged Beis Yaakov primary school, there are several in Poland, in Warsaw, and later in the last part of 1932 became the director of the Beis Yaakov Seminary in Kraków. He says in the introduction that he's using this word Yahadus instead of religia or religion, which was the mandatory subject that all primary school students need to study. And yes, and this is for primary school. It's divided according to grade and according to month. It was 2 weekly hours were devoted to that, whether in full-fledged Beis Yaakov schools or in the afternoon schools, which I'll mention in a minute. While the program for boys was all written in Hebrew, the program for girls was all written in Yiddish. These studies of Yahadus included Jewish history, even prayer, Agada, those stories from the Talmud, and so on. Now, what about these afternoon schools? Most of the Beis Yaakov schools in Poland, I think there were, some scholar mentions there were only 14 full-fledged schools. The rest were afternoon schools for girls who studied in public schools in the morning. Its official status, as far as the state was concerned, was not schools, but courses. This was in response to the request of Agudas Israel, which preferred it being defined as courses, because then there were less requirements in terms of the program and so on. So this is like a formal program, but of course nobody checked what teachers, what they're exactly teaching. I just want to mention here where it says Biblia, Chumash, the Pentateuch and the prophets and Psalms. This was not a textual study. It was not done with the text. Everything was taught in Yiddish. The children had to learn the alphabet. I mean, there was just not enough time to teach them reading skills and Hebrew, and we don't have at all Hebrew in the program, where in Yavneh, Hebrew was emphasized from the beginning. And to finish up this section about the primary school, I just want to quote from a letter of Sarah Shenira, who was the first one to initiate such a school. Know that the Beis Yaakov school doesn't strive to provide a lot of knowledge, but rather a lot of spirit, a great amount of enthusiasm in fulfilling the commandments, a great amount of good character traits. And now we'll move to post-primary education. In Poland, we already talked about Lithuania, and we can see what the differences are. So I already mentioned that other than Chavah that was established under the German occupation, there was no other high school, classical gymnasium in Poland. And here I have two figures. Deutschländer, which I already mentioned. He is important for post-primary school because he is the one who was in charge of developing the professional aspect of the Beis Yaakov Seminary. And the person on the right, Yuda Orlean, which I also mentioned, which became in late 1932 the director of the Beis Yaakov Seminary in Kraków. So Deutschländer, when he was asked at one occasion what he thinks about what happens with girls at age 14, they finish primary school, what they should do. And despite the fact that he was a PhD, he said that this shouldn't be part of the Beis Yaakov education, pursuing gymnasium education, but he explained it not in ideological reasons, but rather in practical reasons. He said that there are no jobs and so on. Unlike Deutschländer, because after all, he couldn't talk against it when he himself and other neo-Orthodox teachers who came to help with the seminary were themselves attended the university. But Orlean, he has a very long article titled "The Gymnasium Idol." And for him, it was an ideological issue. The gymnasium is the modern idol, whom one worships with boundless fanaticism. Our Agudas Israel circles must internalize with complete perspicacity the lack of purpose, harm, and inferiority of a gymnasium education. They must prepare an appeal to Jewish homes for a true Jewish education, for a true Jewish Bildung. So we see from that the parents wanted, at least some, a gymnasium education for their daughters. Otherwise, he wouldn't have to devote a whole article going out against it. The problem with a gymnasium, that the program of study is dictated by the state. It can be controlled. It cannot be controlled or filtered by the Beis Yaakov. So if not a gymnasium, what's a sort of a highest educational option, not just as a vocation, for intellectually motivated Orthodox girls? So this is, of course, the teachers' seminary. And I looked for a long time. It wasn't clear to me what was the status of the seminary in Kraków, because it was intended for the students to become teachers of religion. It wasn't a full-fledged seminary, which in Poland, at least when at this time until 1932, lasted generally for 5 years after primary school. Later, the state required some gymnasium education and so on. And I found in this address book, it gives it's under a chapter of private seminaries. But for this school, what it says, it lists the address under the management of Krakow's central branch of the Organization of Orthodox Jews in Poland, Agudas Israel, maintain a seminary course. So it's still difficult for me to understand exactly the formal status for teachers of the Mosaic religion in Kraków and religion courses, also the Beis Yaakov afternoon school in about 250 towns. The course of study lasted for 2 years. Now I have here, this is an internal document. It's not part of the promotional literature of the movement. Judith Rosenbaum was brought from Frankfurt to help in the seminary because they didn't have qualified teachers. She graduated a seminary, not a Jewish seminary, in Frankfurt, and then attended the university while she was in Kraków. And this is from a minute book. And what she says here, because we have only 2 years, 6 weeks of those 2 years are devoted to a practicum for the girls. Then they need to study pedagogy, psychology, some secular subject, especially for those who would like to be teachers of religion in public schools. We have already said that we have to reduce the number of literature lessons in the upper grade. I would like to consult with Ms. Gross. She was the teacher of Polish literature about this. I'm very sorry, but I see no other way out. Finally, we must not forget that our girls become teachers of religion. So what do you do if you need to balance the program? I really don't know where to reduce. So it's not because she wanted just, she didn't think that Polish literature is needed. There were just not enough time to devote to this. Another document is from a notebook of a seminary student. A bunch of 40 notebooks was purchased by the Central Archives for the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And Chumash, the Pentateuch, this was like the focus of the program. When the girls graduated, they knew Chumash very, very well. But how did they study? So first of all the notes are in Yiddish. They were taught, the teacher gave lectures about the Chumash. They didn't study it with Rashi, with that medieval commentator. Instead, the teacher would summarize some commentaries most of the time, and I went over many of these notebooks already. She would very rarely mention that what she's saying is taken from Rashi or even from Hirsch, for those who are familiar. So they were not provided textual skills. The Hebrew level was very low. Everything was taught in the Yiddish language. They had a Hebrew class, but it was very, very difficult. And everything was done in the Yiddish language. And again, just a reminder, Yavneh put an emphasis on Hebrew skills. Now, what about women's female organization, not schools? So first of all, I want to iterate, there were no Beis Yaakov schools in Lithuania. There were only Yavneh schools. But they had an organization for women, which they called Beis Yaakov. Beis Yaakov is also a generic term. It's from the Pentateuch. it usually denotes women as a collective. So this is why they took that name. On the right, you have a book that was printed on the occasion of 5 years for that organization. And on the left, they also had a journal. The journal was edited by a woman. All the articles were written by women. And this whole booklet, there is nothing written by a man. I didn't emphasize it when we had, oh no, I didn't get to it later. So yeah, forget this. Okay, so now, this is, I'm going to summarize some of what they say about the organization. Oops, what did I do? Oh, from this book on the right, okay? So first of all, the organization itself was founded by a woman, unlike the women organization Benos Agudas Israel, which was founded by Freedom Zone, by a male. It was not associated with a political party. It was non-partisan. They go in length to explain why, because they said we identify with the ideology, but we don't want to associate ourselves with a party because we are open to all women, also to women who are not religious. We want to influence them. So they have no ties to the Agudas Israel party in Lithuania. I won't read all the aims, but just some of them. And the first one is spread the knowledge of Torah among all Jewish sectors. Okay, all Jewish sectors, religious and non-religious, the knowledge of Torah. So here we see again that Lithuanian attitude about study and knowledge. I'll skip some of them. They also are engaged in all kind of charity, things that have to do with Sabbath observance of other religious rituals, and so on. And the last paragraph, drive out ignorance. Now they use the phrase amaratzus, which is really a denigrating term for those who don't have any Jewish religious knowledge. So we see the knowledge is central here. They also organized study group, and in these study groups, I don't have it here. The girls, most of them were already graduate of the Yavneh Hebrew-Gymnasium. They would study on their own the Chumash, the Pentateuch, with Rashi, with the commentator. It's not prohibited for women to study it on their own. It's prohibited for the father or, a school teacher to teach it to them. So every year they would have a party, a siyum for completing a book or whatever. And all their classes were taught in the Hebrew language. Now, what about the organizations of in interwar Poland? So the major one, at least there was one for girls, young girls, which I won't talk about, was Benos Agudas Israel, the daughters of Agudas Israel. So here you could see even the name is affiliated with the political party. It's an arm of a political party. Here we have two brochures about the purpose of Benos. This one was written by Rogovi. He was a director of one of the Yaakov schools in Warsaw. And he's the one who says, what is this association about? And what they list, they call it principles. So I'll just read a few of them as before. 1, faith in one God and his providence. 2, recognize the Torah sages as the major authority in all aspects of Jewish life. I can't go into it now, but this corresponds to what is called Das Torah, the idea that the Torah sages are experts in everything, beyond the Torah, in all aspects of life. So you see, it's already like the second principle to instill it in the girls' hearts and mind. Fulfill the requirements to bring the Torah spirit into the Jewish home. Number 4 has to do with knowledge. So let's see how it's written. Deepen the Jewish ideals of our prophets and sages by attaining a greater amount of Jewish knowledge. Now, I didn't add mainly in Yiddish, it's there. They say, although the preferred thing would be to read the text in the original Hebrew language. Maybe, they say, it will happen in the future, but it will be attained only by a very small number of women. That is why it has to be done in the Yiddish language. So we have here like a sphere for women where religious studies are taught in Yiddish. So there's no need to develop textual skills and the way this is, of course, you know, they can read the Chumash, the Pentateuch with Yiddish translations, also translation of Rashi and so on. As a matter of fact, they had to bring one of those books, seminary students to the seminary, but the study was not done with the Hebrew text, which is really a big difference between Poland and Lithuania. Work with love for reviving the Jewish people in the land of Israel according to the spirit of our Holy Torah. So this is like, you know, against Zionism. Preserve Jewish names, modesty in dress. There's nothing about modesty in dress in the Lithuanian Bais Yaakov organization. The Jewish language and the holiness of Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh. Move away from a non-Jewish life and fight against contemporary free thinking. So until now, I spoke about Lithuania proper as a country and Poland. What about those Lithuanian regions that were annexed to Poland after following World War I? Okay, oops, yeah. So what I'm going to introduce now is an article in the Polish Bais Yaakov journal, written by, it's from 1929, written by a teacher named Chavah Landsberg. As you see, it's the lead, well, you don't really see it, I cut it. It's the lead article in the journal. And what does she say? So she lists, first of all, she starts, I don't have it here. She writes like to potential candidates for the Kraków Seminary. She said, if you think that you're coming to Kraków so you can go to the theater and to the Wawel and to the park, you're mistaken, and so on. But I didn't include that part. She lists 3 categories of candidates for the Kraków Bais Yaakov Seminary. 1, candidates who do not possess the required knowledge and are thus turned away. 2, graduates of the Bais Yaakov schools. I think she means afternoon schools. And 3, and I marked it in blue because this is what concerns us here, those who acquire their religious knowledge from foreign sources. This is a 3rd category. The latter, coming primarily from the Lithuanian regions, namely the Lithuanian Polish regions like Vilna, Grodno, whatever, are graduates of Hebrew school, mostly Tarbut school, which are the Zionist schools that were all run in Hebrew, and come to the seminary to get a vocational training. So they coming to Kraków to learn a job. The school presents itself not just the seminary, not just a place for training teachers, but it's like to mold the character, to create a new type of Orthodox women. The Lithuanians, they come for a vocation. And then she continues, comparing the work of the seminary to the work of a gardener. Landsberg added that concerning the third category, where wild weeds had already developed, we must adopt ways to isolate. I have it in red because I'll refer to it later, so I want you to pay attention to that. We must adopt ways to isolate the weeds, and over the next 2 years to be able to demonstrate that the soil has been cleaned. So she doesn't have many nice things to say about the candidates who come from the Lithuanian regions. We'll see. She, 1 second. Yeah. And she goes on. She emphasizes the contrast, and she goes at much length with it. I just summarize and take a few quotes. She emphasizes the contrast between candidates from these schools. And I'll say, if I'll have time, maybe during the Q&A session, how come those girls went to a Talmud school, which was Zionist, and they were not religious schools. From these schools and the candidates from our Bais Yaakov schools, and she comments, we see here the paramount necessity to establish Bais Yaakov school in these Lithuanian regions. Now, there were only a few Bais Yaakov schools in the Polish-Lithuanian regions. Vilna had no Bais Yaakov school. Grodno, where there is a famous yeshiva, had no Bais Yaakov school. Radin, where the Chafetz Chaim, who everybody uses his famous letter that he tells parents that they should send the daughters to Bais Yaakov. Radin didn't have a Bais Yaakov school, and so many others. There were only a few. Landsberg explained that the seminary was forced to expel some students of the third category, the Lithuanian category. And this is what she says about them. They grew up on foreign soil and brought with them a foreign air. Their way of thinking is also foreign. Can we allow the foreign bad weeds to take root with us and develop? That is why we need to be on guard and lock the door to foreign influence. Pretty strong. And she writes it in the journal at a time when there are students in the seminary that are coming from this region. And now to sort of give another angle, an angle of a seminary student who came from the Vilna region. So and the seminary, those girls were called Lithuanian. It didn't mean that they came from Lithuania. They came from these regions. And the Polish girls, usually they were referred to as the Hasidic daughters. So what I recently discovered, I'm still working on it, is a diary of a student at the Kraków Seminary, 1929. So she was there when Landsberg wrote her article. Landsberg was a teacher. She says terrible things about her, which is not our subject here. I don't know if she got offended or whatever. She writes her diary in Hebrew. She was her father worked as he raised funds for the Chafetz Chaim yeshiva. So he was a rabbinical Jew. He would go around to raise money, and he sent her. And she writes about it in her diary after she finished primary school in a public school. And she also got tutored in Jewish subjects. She wanted to become a teacher, And she convinced her father to send her to Vilna, to the Talmud teacher seminary. It was a co-ed seminary. It lasted for 5 years. After 2 years of being there, her father decided to take her out. He thought that it's a secular institution and it will have a bad influence on her, and he sends her to Bais Yaakov in Kraków, and she writes a lot of things about the seminary. I'm preparing now an article about the diary and what she writes about the seminary. Now, some of the things that she writes in her diary. Now, she is there before girls entered the new building only in 1931. In the summer of 1931, the building wasn't even finished. So she studied on 30 Augustianska Street, and that's also where they lived, some of them. So this is what she writes. The Lithuanian girls, again, she calls them all Lithuanians. She identifies as a Lithuanian, but she's from the small town outside of Vilna. The Lithuanian girls lived in a special room on 30 Augustianska Street, and the Polish girls on Katarzyna Street. Katarzyna was the apartment of Sarah Schneer. So you see, when Landsberg was talking about isolating them, they didn't mix them. They put the Lithuanian girls they lived together. They were not mixed with the Polish Hasidic girls. She calls, as I said, all the Polish girls Hasidic daughters. So this was done on purpose. Her teacher, Chavah Landsberg, lived with them in her home, but because of many problems that developed between the teacher, between her and the student, they switched. And Chavah Landsberg later moved to Schneer's apartment, and Sarah Schneer moved to Katarzyna. And she lived with the Lithuanian girls. I guess they thought that it will be a good influence on them. And because she had she lived so close, was in the same place as Sarah Schneer, she writes a lot about Sarah Schneer, and it's very different from the hagiographies that we're used to. Now, this is what she says. This naturally, the separate living quarters affected the friendship created between the students from both regions. One of the major differences between the two was language. Almost all the Lithuanian students knew Hebrew, a result of the fact that most of them previously attended Talmud schools. So Landsberg was correct. It was true for these girls, Orthodox girls. They were also familiar with Hebrew literature, and the diarist writes a lot. She had many Hebrew literature books. Sarah Schneer told her to send it home, and she said, I can't because it's too expensive. And then she continues, the diarist. There is an abyss between the girls from Poland and those from Lithuania, a sort of a misunderstanding. Back home, the Lithuanian girls continue to behave as they did before attending the Bais Yaakov Seminary. They all visit the movies and the theater, as she herself did. She also had boys when she was off for twice a year. They had like a month off from the seminary, and she had boys coming to visit her in her home. So she didn't do it in secret. Unlike the Hasidic girls, she means Polish girls. I guess most of them were Hasidic. I mean, it's not I guess, I'm sure. Who follow religious instructions just because Mrs. Schneer said something is forbidden. The Lithuanian girls are not satisfied with such reasoning. They expect teachers to show them where it is written. There are many instructions that I can't accept. For example, the prohibition to give a hand to a man. Giving a hand expresses friendship among acquaintances and is a European practice. She says that her father didn't object when she did it. perhaps this can be applied to the undeveloped Hasidic girls who are coming from nowhere, but not to those from educated Jewish Lithuania. So she has like a, she talks about the Lithuanian with like a pride of origin. Okay, I'm getting close to finish up. The Bais Yaakov deliberately blocked the path to higher education for Orthodox women by providing not only an alternative educational path, they were just looking for something else, for a different education, but an alternative model of female fulfillment. And again, in a way of concluding, the Yavneh model. The administration of the Lithuanian Yavneh organization was composed of members from Agudas Israel and Mizrahi, rabbis. It was not a party organization, and the administration were rabbis. Some of them were Mizrahi, the Zionist Orthodox party, and some of them Agudas Israel. Yavneh higher educational institutions for girls emphasized their high-level study in Jewish and general subjects. The Lithuanian female organization Bais Yaakov was founded, directed, and run by women. Its Yiddish journal was edited by a woman, and articles were written by women. The Lithuanian ethos of erudition, intellectual rigor, and a more lenient attitude to secular subject, which until the war applied only to male, after World War I applied also to female. The Polish Bais Yaakov model. The Polish Bais Yaakov movement was managed by the Agudas Israel party, which was dominated by Hasidic figures. It created a separate sphere for female education, completely distinct from male education. The editors of the Bais Yaakov journal were all males, the editorial board, and so were most of the writers. The Hasidic ethos of piety, religious enthusiasm, and isolation from the outside society and culture, which until World War I applied only to male, girls were sent to public schools or private schools, was applied after World War I also to female. This shared Hasidic ethos should be included in the discussion on the question whether women can be considered Hasidim, but this is beyond the scope of this lecture. And with that, this is my last word. Thank you very much.